Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon and welcome to the Electoral Commission. This afternoon we're hosting live from Sandton, but we are the Centurion people. This afternoon, allow me to warmly welcome you. It's the onset of winter, so warmness becomes important. On that note, let me welcome to this event the masters of the Electoral Commission, the commissioners, the people that make sure that work is done, this country is ready for the upcoming elections, everything that needs to happen happens. Let me welcome Ndate Mosutu, the chairperson of the IEC. Also, let me welcome Commissioner Love, the vice chairperson of the IEC. Let me welcome Judge Pillay, also commissioner of the IEC. Let me welcome Ndate Mashinini, commissioner of the IEC. Let me also welcome Mepiso, also a commissioner of the IEC. Also, let me welcome someone that I call the chief of this house, Ntate Saima Mabolo, the chief electoral officer of the Electoral Commission of South Africa. Equally so, are joined this afternoon by the full leadership of the Electoral Commission. In our midst, we've got deputy CEOs for the 4 divisions of the Electoral Commission. In this audience as well, we're joined by the provincial electoral officers from all the 9 provinces of our country. These are the ladies and gentlemen who ensure that if ever you need to have a voting station opened, they'll make sure that it's opened, the resources and everything else that accompanies it. Also in our midst, we are joined by senior managers of the Electoral Commission, and within also our base of stakeholders in this afternoon, we also have got the political parties, we also have got civil society, we also have got members of the media. So basically it is a full house. As the program progresses, as we warm up to this event, is one of those events when we look at the onset of elections, we know that one more time, the Electoral Commission of South Africa, in partnership with key stakeholders of our work, are benchmarking the breaking ground on areas that no other electoral management body has done it, but we're doing it this afternoon. As we look at the publication that will be launching, that will be unveiling, that will be taken to libraries in this country, that will be taking as part of the body of knowledge on elections, this publication will once again deliver another benchmark for this continent, not only of Africa, but internationally. It's a book that will go a very long distance in ensuring that our young South Africans, other people across the world, are taking electoral democracy as a key area of study. Without much ado, allow me to call to the podium Commissioner Judge Pillay from the Electoral Commission of South Africa, who's going to do the welcoming remarks and just ensure that all of us are settled in this particular event. Mme Pillay, if you may please come through.
Thank you, Program Director Kate Papela, and thank you also for taking care of many of my responsibilities of identifying all our people here. But let me acknowledge the chairperson of the IEC, my fellow commissioners, the chief electoral officer, the DCEOs, and their teams, and a special welcome to our panelists who stand by us through these difficult times when we need to figure things out and find our way academically to give some grounding to our intuitive sense of what is the right thing to do. And a special welcome to our Mauritian visitor, Professor Rukea Casanelli. Thank you. And all of you, I hope you are feeling welcomed and well fed. In 2022, after the IEC the Electoral Commission of South Africa assumed the chairpersonship of the Association of World Election Management Bodies, AWEB, it launched its legacy project. That was the first contribution to the first contribution to that project was a special issue of a journal titled Safeguarding EMBs in the Age of Democratic Recession, which we published in November 23. That publication was a compilation of papers presented at the conference in 2022 on the same subject. This event is to launch the second publication as another contribution to academia and research. It is also a compilation of papers presented at a conference in 2025 on political funding. So there's a gap of about 2 or 3 years between our last publication. And this contribution to academia, to South Africa, and to the international community, I think, in such a short space of time, should be acknowledged, and you can applaud if you wish. And, and we must also acknowledge the leadership provided by Dr. Shale in this regard. So, why is South Africa and the IEC involved in political funding? This year, South Africa celebrates 30 years of its final constitution, which was adopted in 1996. We have much to celebrate equally. We have much to lament and angst about. 30 years ago, we were euphoric about the Bill of Rights, particularly the rights to equality and the multiple freedoms it bestowed on us. Today, our lived reality exposes the tensions between equality and freedoms. Because for as long as people have different capabilities, exercising the rights to freedoms will yield different outcomes. Not everyone can enjoy the freedom to practice a profession, engage in trade, and own private property, all the freedoms that the Constitution allows us. If democracy and constitutions were expected to deliver the goods, the reality is disappointing. Parity of participation, parity of performance, and parity of politics. In a constitutional democracy ensconced in a macroeconomic capitalist environment would be altogether elusive unless mechanisms are found to level the playing fields. And that's where we come in. Leveling the playing fields to conduct free, fair, and inclusive elections is the business of the IEC. While the IEC is not in the business of designing and defining macroeconomic policy, the political funding laws give the IEC a really very tiny peephole entry into managing and overseeing the funding of political participation. The law allows the IEC to regulate political funding, to receive and distribute contributions from two funds, statutorily established, to monitor the funds that political parties and independent candidates receive from local and overseas donors, to monitor how they spend those funds, and finally, to enforce compliance with the rules on funding. Enforcement is proving to be a challenge when political funding is subversive. The IEC does not have the investigative capacity to detect offenses. Of course, what it does not see, it cannot act on. What it does not hear is hearsay. Whether donations are made in exchange for personal gain remains speculation, gossip, and sometimes even a veiled maneuver to take out an opponent. The IEC depends significantly on whistleblowers to effectively enforce political funding law. Additionally, in this age of heightened geopolitical tensions, we must all be vigilant of our sovereignty. I deal with political funding and sovereignty in more detail in an article that the Daily Maverick published last year. But for now, let me highlight a few warnings. Who owns who uses whose technology, and how money flows in both the local and international spheres are the business of political funding, management, and oversight. This is a tall ask of the IEC. Like the judiciary, the IEC has no sword, no army of investigators, and no purse to pay for the kind of investigations needed to successfully enforce political funding law. All the IEC has is the pen to inform, to educate, to guide, to support, and to urge all political actors to be honest, transparent, and accountable. For this is what it means to be patriotic. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Commissioner. This is just the beginning of the launch of this particular special issue. I'm going to call on at the podium Ntate Mama Bolo just to deal with the summary of this special issue. Ntate Mama Bolo, as you take the podium.
Thank you, Program Director. Greetings to the Chairperson of the Commission, Ndatem Sotumiepia, members of the Commission, our distinguished guest, Professor Kasanali all the way from Mauritius, dear colleagues, contributors, and friends. It is both a privilege and a pleasure to stand before you as a guest editor of this special edition of the African Journal of Elections, which is dedicated to the vital and evolving subject of political financing in South Africa. This occasion is made even more meaningful as it coincides with the 30th anniversary of the Electoral Institute of Southern Africa, a milestone that invites reflection not only on institutional endurance, but also on the deepening of democratic practice across our region. Over 3 decades, the Institute has played a pivotal role in strengthening electoral integrity, advancing research, and fostering informed public dialogue. This special issue is, in many ways, a continuation of that legacy. Political financing remains one of the most consequential but contested dimension of democratic governance. It shapes the competitiveness of elections, the accountability of political actors, and ultimately the trust that citizens place in institutions of governance. Yet it is also an area marked by complexity, opacity, and persistent reform debates. It is precisely for this reason that sustained scholarly engagement is both necessary and urgent. This special edition brings together 9 rigorously peer-reviewed academic articles, each contributing to a richer and more nuanced understanding of political financing in South Africa. Collectively, these articles are organized around 4 interrelated themes. The first theme addresses the theoretical framework for political financing. These contributions engage with the foundational questions. That is, what principles should guide the regulation of money in politics? How do we balance transparency, fairness, and political freedom? And what models best capture the realities of emerging and established democracies alike? By grounding the discussion in theory, this article provides essential tools for interpreting both policy and practice. The second theme turns to public funding of political parties. In South Africa, public funding has long been viewed as a mechanism to level the playing field and to support multi-party democracy. Yet, as the articles in this section demonstrate, important questions remain regarding allocation formulas, oversight mechanisms, and the extent to which public resources can or should shape political competition. This contributions critically assesses the achievements and limitations of existing frameworks whilst pointing toward possible reform. The third theme examines private financing of political parties, an area that has historically been less transparent but no less influential. With recent regulatory developments aimed at increasing disclosure and accountability, South Africa finds itself at an important moment. The articles in this section explore the sources, patterns, and implications of private funding, as well as the challenges of enforcement and compliance. They remind us that transparency alone is not sufficient. It must be accompanied by robust institutions and a political culture of accountability. The fourth and final theme offers a comparative analysis. By situating South Africa within a broader international context, these contributions allow us to draw lessons from other jurisdictions while also highlighting the distinctiveness of our own history and experience. Comparative work is especially valuable in a field like political financing, where no single model offers a perfect solution. Instead, it is through careful comparison that we can identify adaptable practices and avoid. It's the beginning of winter. Instead, it is through careful comparison that we can identify adaptable practices and avoid common pitfalls. What emerges from this collection is not a single unified conclusion, but rather a textured and dynamic conversation. The strength of this special issue lies in its diversity of perspectives, the methodological, theoretical, and normative. Together, these 9 articles do more than document the current state of political financing. They challenge us to think more critically about the future. So, as a co-guest editor, I would like to extend my sincere gratitude to all the authors for their thoughtful and rigorous contributions, as well as the constructive engagement, and to the editorial and production teams whose efforts has made this publication possible. Our gratitude to you. My thanks also go to the Electoral Institute of Southern Africa for its continued leadership in promoting research and dialogue on electoral matters. As we celebrate 30 years of institutional impact, we are also reminded that democracy is never a finished product. The regulation of political finance will continue to evolve, shaped by legal reforms, political realities, and societal expectations. It is our hope that this special edition will serve not only as a scholarly resource, but as a catalyst for ongoing debate, policy innovation, and democratic strengthening. I wish to thank you and acknowledge the winter.
Thank you very much, Ntate Mamabulo. This publication is the only internationally accredited journal uniquely dedicated to African elections. On that note, allow me to call Ntate Mahlangu, who is the Deputy CEO for Political Party Funding, to receive this journal that will begin a journey on unraveling what it means to manage party funding in this continent. Ntate Mahlangu, over to you.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Allow me to welcome all of you and stand on the protocols that has been established. Chairperson of the Electoral Commission, I am going to hand over to you the special issue Journal of African Elections with the following heading: Sustaining Multi-Party Democracy Through Enhancing Political Funding in South Africa. It started with a symposium in Durban that concentrated on political funding, and it ended up with this journal. I hand over this to you, Chairperson.
Chairperson, I'm not sure. You've got history in your hands. Right there in your hands, you've got history. So, Maraka utlwa matsogo. Did you applaud? Okay. May I request Ntate Moepia? You know, when I'm born of the Northern Sotho people, right there, Kwale Limpopo. Whenever something magnificent like this happens, it's not a normal occasion. So Ntate Moepa, can you please receive this baby and tell us the name of this baby? What is this baby made of? Just receive. We need those remarks. We need to hear why this is so critical for our continent, not only for South Africa. Please come and tell us about the baby. Thank you.
You know, I have learned that technology is beautiful, but you must have a backup, just in case. Yeah. Members of the commission and my dear colleagues in the work we do, the Chief Electoral Officer and the senior leadership of the Electoral Commission of South Africa, leaders and representatives of political parties present here today, the executive director and staff of EISA, editors and contributors to the Journal of African Elections, distinguished researchers, academics, and election practitioners present here, members of the Fourth Estate, friends of the Electoral Commission of South Africa, ladies and gentlemen. The Electoral Commission of South Africa is profoundly honored to launch this special issue of the Journal of African Elections today. And in this city, the city of gold, our economic heartbeat in South Africa. Today's launch is more than a mere academic milestone. It represents the culmination of a rigorous intellectual journey. It is a continuation of a high-level conversation that gained significant momentum during our June 2025 symposium, as you were told. That gathering proved that the intersection of money and politics is not merely a matter of accounting, but a fundamental question of democratic survival in our time. The volume we present today, the one that I was the first to receive, entitled Sustaining Multi-Party Democracy Through Enhancing Political Funding in South Africa, finds its depth in the caliber of its contributors. We have achieved a rare synergy in this work. I say so because on one hand, we have esteemed scholars who brought their analytical rigor and peer review integrity to the electoral democracy scholarship. But on the other hand, we have practitioners from the Electoral Commission who operate in the coal face of this work we do, election management. This theory meets practice approach is essential if we are to start and move beyond the rhetoric and towards sustainability in the work of maintaining electoral democracy. Before delving into the substance of the journal, I must pause to acknowledge our partner, the Electoral Institute for Sustainable Democracy in Africa, EISA, as they are known. Since 1996, EISA has been a sentinel of democratic integrity across our continent. As EISA celebrates its 30th anniversary, we reflect on 3 decades of diligent work to promote credible elections and strengthen governance institutions across this continent. EISA, your contribution to this special issue is yet another testament to your commitment to democratic accountability. On behalf of the Electoral Commission of South Africa, we congratulate you on this remarkable journey and milestone. May the next 30 years be even more impactful as we navigate evolving challenges of our time. Thank you. Thank you. The central thesis of this special issue is a complex one. To be clear, the issue is not money in and of itself. To paraphrase a well-known philosophical tenet, it is not the existence of currency, but rather a disordered attachment to that currency. In a modern electoral democracy, money is neither inherently virtuous nor inherently harmful. It is a tool of mobilization. As the Commission has noted in its recent policy reviews, democracy is an expensive exercise. Sustained funding is the lifeblood of a functioning multi-party system we have come to observe. A properly and ethically funded democracy offers 3 critical outcomes. First, it offers organizational vitality. It enables political parties to build permanent structures, develop policy alternatives, and campaign effectively. Second, it informs participation. It facilitates voter outreach and education, ensuring that the will of the people is based on information rather than impulse. Third and finally, it is competitive and promotes competitive equity. It supports a pluralistic environment where new entrants can join or leave, all on entrants leave the field, as it were, without hindrance or being forced to either stay or to leave. This is very important in sustaining democracy, and it doesn't matter where you find yourself, but in particular for a modern day democracy in South Africa. Conversely, money becomes deeply pernicious when it operates in the shadows. As highlighted by several contributors in this volume, unregulated or dark money can, one, distort the playing field by creating a plutocracy where only the wealthy are heard. Secondly, it can facilitate policy capture where the legislative agenda is dictated by the highest bidder rather than the public good. And thirdly, it can erode dignity by manifesting in the politics of the stomach or vote buying, which treats the voter not as a citizen, but as a commodity. There is no gainsaying that democracy is an expensive enterprise. In the global south, where we face competing priorities of education, healthcare, and infrastructure, the billions of rands required for election administration can seem prohibitive and sometimes stop people and organizations from participating in democracy. However, as a commission, we must remain firm in our conviction. The cost of not having a democracy is exponentially higher unless those of us that work in this field raise the concerns we see and we experience on a daily basis. History teaches us that the price of authoritarian or autocratic rule is paid in the currency of lost personal freedoms, economic stagnation, and human suffering. These are things South Africa has experienced and understands far too well to sit back and do nothing about them. We cannot wish them away. The necessity of money in politics is self-explanatory. It's clear. It is evident. And so to look the other way and not deal with these challenges would be naive. Instead, our challenge, as interrogated in this journal, is to ensure that the use of money enhances democracy rather than subverting it. South Africa has made significant strides in this regard. Most notably, the Political Party Funding Act 6 of 2018 bears testament. It is not perfect. It is just the beginning of the journey. There is much that can be done, but we needed to start somewhere. And the journey has indeed started. Let us engage with it. Let us move from private domain understanding of party funding to one that is public in its interest, transparency, and outlook. However, legislation is not static. Even as we say, well, you have this legislation, it has its flaws. As I said, it must be made a living framework. And this is where I invite all of us to journey together. The contribution of this special edition offer timely critiques of our current regime, particularly in the light of the Electoral Matters Amendment Act and the evolving jurisprudence of the Constitutional Court. We must ask ourselves, is our transparency meaningful or merely procedural? This is a question that must never escape us. We are better off when those with the means to sustain democracy use their financial resources ethically. We are worse off when democracy is viewed as a commodity to be bought and owned. As an electoral management body, the Electoral Commission of South Africa's role is one of continuous vigilance. We are the custodians of the regulatory framework that ensures transparency, accountability, and fairness. Without such a framework, democracy runs the risk of being sold to the highest bidder, whose hands may not be clean and whose intention may be less than honorable. This special issue of the Journal of African Elections does not seek to close the canon on political funding. On the contrary, it is an invitation. It is an invitation to scholars to dig deeper into the data, to practitioners to refine their regulations, and to the public to demand greater transparency. The insights contained in these pages will be a vital resource for policymakers and scholars alike as we prepare for the circle of our democratic journey that is evolving and at times evolving truly fast. I am confident that the rigor displayed here will contribute to a democracy that is not only multi-party in name, but representative in substance and outlook. As we launch this volume here today, let us recommit ourselves to the idea that our democracy is not for sale. It belongs to the people, and it is our collective duty to protect it. God has blessed us with a time such as this. A nation such as the one we are entrusted to preside over its affairs. May we have the wisdom, the courage, and the skills to navigate it properly so that no generation beyond us will suffer because we did not do what we have been called to do at a time such as this. Thank you very much for being here, and thank you for this copy that we now launch here today. Have a good afternoon indeed.
Thank you so much, Chairperson. Your job is not yet done. May you please, you still have one more critical task to do. May I invite Professor Kasanali to the stage, the center of the stage. Ntate, if you may please do the honors of handing over the book to her. Remember, it's an African book, so we pass it on from one generation to the other, one nation to the other. If you may please do that. May I also invite, everywhere there must be witnesses. And Tate Moepi also fades. May I please, as you sit, you and Professor Kasanelli, Tate Moepi, please come back. And Tate Mahlangu, you saw the baby first. So witnesses are important. And Tate Mamabolo, may we please have a photo opportunity before we get into the next session, so that as this book is handed over from generation to generation, there's witnesses to that effect. Thank you. Photographers, are you in hand? Yeah. Yeah, all right. History in the making. Photographers, are you good? Are you covered? Right, Tebogela, another massive round of applause. Professor Kasanelli, everywhere, when you receive, let's hear. Let's hear your journey on this particular book as you receive it, your remarks before we move into the next session. Thank you so much. Please come to the podium.
What would we do without our notes and our books? So, first, I would like to thank you so much for supporting EISA. I think it has returned 30, which is a young adult, isn't it? And it's been very fundamental and very instrumental in the shaping of democracy in South Africa and across the continent. So, thank you, Chair, for those words of support and kindness. So, I'll just have a couple of op- remarks just on the behalf of ISA. So all protocols observe commissioners of the Independent Electoral Commission, guest editors. I know the work has always been very hard. So we have two guest editors and colleagues, friends, and distinguished guests. Welcome to you all on a cold Johannesburg winter. Has the ushering of winter. I think this is also goes very well for the discussion. So I'm currently the chief editor of the Journal of African Elections, JAE, also a former chair of EISA for good 10 years. And I'm honored today to be part of this very important event. I think we heard a lot priorly in terms of the importance of such scholarly work, in terms of setting the scene and establishing, the necessary evidence-based research, in terms of making us understand the importance of political financing. As the chair mentioned, democracy is a very expensive endeavor. It's also, elections are increasingly very expensive. And the problem very often when it's expensive, it seems to crowd out those that don't have access to funds. And across the African continent and beyond, we see this rising problem. So understanding how political party funding and financing and expenses can help us, create a much more, equal, inclusive society is fundamental. So my association with EISA now spans some 20 years, which makes me not look very young. But first as a researcher, I remember in 2015, and then as a chair of EISA, and then now the editor of the GAE. So it's a privilege to see this partnership continue and deepen. So today's event, I think we heard that, is very significant because it brings together what we call scholarship work, practice. Very often we have scholarship, but we don't have practice, and institutional leadership. So it's a unique trio that has come together to bring this journal special edition. The J, plays and I think continues, and hopefully in the next 30 years, as the chair wished us, plays a vital role in as a truly African journal, contributing to the continent's democratic knowledge landscape. And I think we always talked about, the leadership from the South. We have, all been colonized in various ways and in various methods. But I think it's something deeply rooted in our continent's tradition in South-South collaboration is fundamental. And I think this is very much the work of the GAE. So the thematic that we talked about, political party funding, is both urgent and highly relevant, particularly, Chair, as your forthcoming local government elections. I think it will be very helpful and important in terms of providing the necessary, as you said, methods, approaches, understanding. It hinges on issues linking to funding, transparency on funding, accountability, regulation, which are central to issues such as democratic integrity. We talk a lot about electoral integrity, democratic integrity, public trust. Now, at a time when we see big deficit in public trust. People trust less those who they vote, trust less in the quality of elections. So these are important sort of gaps that we need to fill in. This is especially critical as we are marked in a global climate which is defined by continuous democratic backsliding. I think the varieties of democracy, Afrobarometer, and other important research-based evidence demonstrates that there has been 18 years, I think, of systematic democratic backsliding. A country where I come from, Mauritius, which was always seen as the star of of democracy, just got back its place of being an electoral democracy after 10 years of backsliding. So just to say, and I think as the chair mentioned, we should not take democracy for granted. We should always be able to invest in ensuring that democracy is not an end product, it is a continuous process. We see also the rise of authoritarianism, and I think, again, varieties of democracy pointed to the fact that people now in the world live more in autocratic societies than democratic societies. But I see this as an opportunity to actually make democracy work more for people, and I think it's also very important to see that I think Afrobarometer data demonstrates that citizens of in Africa want more democracy. They believe in democracy. So I think this is an opportunity for us to sort of build on the resilience of democracy. So the special edition that the issue that we have already just launched, built on the symposium of last year, and it demonstrates how meaningful dialogue can be translated into concrete knowledge outputs as we see today. So I would like to also congratulate on the behalf of EISA, the IEC, especially its commitment to advancing thoughtful, research-informed electoral discourses. You could have just sat in your, what we call ivory tower, but you really came out and, and demonstrated why partnership is extremely important, why investing in knowledge is extremely important. So thank you for doing that. Also, deserves a round of applause. I also would like to extend a very warm appreciation to our two guest editors, Mr. Sarai Mamabula and Dr. Victor Shali. Thank you so much. I know, thank you for your intellectual leadership. Thank you for your commitment in making sure that, we have today's launch happen. I remember, I think it was last year, receiving a call from Victor, for about this special issue, and said, Rukaya, we need to have a special issue. Is this possible? We were all acutely, aware that there was limited time, but we all, pulled up our socks together and made it happen. So thank you, Victor, for that call, and thank you for today's, coming up with this very important journal, special edition of this journal. So, obviously there are many more people behind that. And, a journal special issue requires editorial management. It requires technical coordination. It requires scholarly contribution. So it's a whole body of people, of commitment, of, burning the midnight oil, I'm sure, of pulling our hair, how to get the language right. But it happens. So thank you to all this important backstage to make sure that the journal special edition came out. It also, as we said earlier, coincides with the 30 years of EISA. Over 3 decades, EISA has evolved from a South Africa-based institution, for those of you who remember, to a truly continental one. The breadth and scope of its programs, its presence in multiple country offices have been instrumental in making democracy much more impactful, especially at a time when building democratic resilience across the continent is essential and fundamental. So EISA's work is grounded in partnerships such as the one that we have with you, Chair, a model which is reflected in terms of institutional trust, shared learning, shared experiences, and regional leadership in electoral practice. So EISA marks 3 decades on the continent. We look forward for its continuing vision and leadership as it implements its 2026, 2030 strategic plan, which is built on adapting to a rapidly changing context, responding to democratic backsliding and technological disruption. Key priorities will include empowering women, youth, and marginalized groups, strengthening and making elections more credible and inclusive, supporting effective electoral institutions, and advancing responsible digital democracy. So EISA therefore wishes to reaffirm its strong support for the IEC and to acknowledge in particularly its professionalism, its independence, and leadership. So we are really all aware that we are living in very fraught and uncertain times. This reality is imposed as to have what we call collective responsibility. It's not the responsibility of one group, but it's the responsibility of everyone to work together to strengthen the understanding and the practice and value of democracy. At the same time, there are clear opportunities. I see it more as opportunities than dangers. It's a continent where citizens demand greater respect for democracy. Democracy remains significant in their livelihoods. We have a very powerful youth dividend. I think that has on many occasions been seen as one of the continent's strengths. And where technology definitely offers avenues for accountability and transparency, whether it's getting young voters to vote, to be engaged, to demand accountability and transparency, and to actually, to power organize movements like the Gen Z movement. Right, I think it happened in many African countries, South Africa being one, Kenya, Senegal, and so many examples. So these are important elements that we need to sort of hang on to. So in closing, allow me to congratulate all the contributors on a timely, impactful publication and reaffirm EISA's commitment to knowledge, partnership, and democratic integrity across the African continent. So thank you very much for your kind attention and for allowing EISA to say these few words of thanks. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor. May I request Professor as well as Ntate Mosotho to go and sign witnessing, and then we sign to make sure that that book, as it goes out into many nations, makes a massive difference. As they sign the book is available in electronic and print format as part of ensuring that this book, this special issue, goes a long distance. We'll be also sharing the copies with the audience that is here. And we're hoping that that copy that we're going to get in your hand, you'll review, you'll read, you'll write about, you'll share with many other people, and ensure that it goes a long, long, long distance. Baholo as elders sign, always is elders that sign. Nekopa Ntate CEO, Ntate Mamabolo, as well as Ntate Mahlangu. They'll also do the second set of signatures. Then we'll be moving to the next session. May I request Electoral Commission staff to share copies with our guests as we make this moment historic. Ntate Mamabolo, Ntate Mahlangu. Another massive round of applause as you get your free copies. A moment in time. On that note, allow me to call onto this podium Professor Kasanali who will be mediating this coming session. And then it's going to be a panel discussion that will be joined by Dr. Victor Shali, also Professor Kotsia, Dr. Mkunu, Ntate Matsobane, Ntate Nkonko, as well as Dr. Tesma. Meheda will be joining as well. If the panelists come and join on the stage as I hand over the mic to Professor Kasanali to facilitate this particular panel. That copy is important. You know, not don't stress. Ne? If you want a bit of a signature, when we break, when we, at the end of the process proceedings, you'll get some signatures. Professor, please take over.
Thanks for going right. Right. So I endorse another hat now as a moderator. So I'll take you. So as we wait for our to settle down, right? So this is just a sample of some of the. So there are 4 contributors out of the 9 contributors. We wish we had all the 9, so as to be able to sort of do justice. But we curated a sample which provides us with an understanding of some of the key issues. So we've got Dr. Shale, who's going to talk about political funding regimes and trajectory of change, which provides a much more sort of broader approach. And then we've got Professor Kodzi, who's going to talk about democracy, elections, and political funding. And then Dr. Mushunu, who's going to talk about political funding in South Africa, critical assessment of regulation, strategies, and impact. And then lastly, not lastly, but then Mr. and Coco, who's going to talk about implementation of political funding successes, challenges and lessons learned. And finally, Dr. Heather, who's going to talk about corporate fundings of politics. And I think this is an extremely important element because very often it's the private sector, the corporate world that provides money to political parties. But then the question is, how do we ensure that the necessary sort of systems and framework is done so that, you know, money is clean and so on and so forth. So we will hear from this wonderful panel. So you each have 10 minutes, and beyond that 10 minutes, I will get very agitated because the idea is also we will have a respondent in the person of Professor Pearl Sithole, who will be a respondent to your papers, and then obviously plenary discussion because we will then invite for a good 40 minutes discussions and questions from the floor. So I would like to invite you, Dr. Shale, to maybe speak to your paper, and you've got 10 minutes.
Prof, thank you very much. Protocol, as has been laid out, is observed. If I say anything wrong, ask Professor Kotze. He was my PhD supervisor some 14, 15 years ago. So he still takes the responsibility that I say all the correct things. Chair, thank you very much. Mine I'm going to try to make this snappy because this is about the theory, as has already been indicated, that the first thematic area of the journal is grounded on theories and so forth. So I'm not going to bore you with any of the theories, just to say that the journal then contains a bouquet of theoretical propositions, beginning, for instance, or including theory or democratic theory, public goods theory, clientelist theory, social contract theory, ambition theory, cartel theory. The myriad of these theories really give a solid ground for some of the propositions that many of my colleagues traverse throughout the volume. Um, this thematic area not only covers these theories, but also deals with the trends and regimes or regime types. I think if you look at most of these theories, common features there have to do with the fact that it's about the people, it's about participation. So most of these theories do place citizens at the center, even if they propose or hold different views, as it were. And so we deal with the evolution of the subject matter based on all these theoretical or theories that I have laid out. Now, what you then see in that first thematic area is then an attempt, and I think most authors in that section have succeeded to sort of showcase the interplay between the regime types and the theories. If you look at the literature, you'll find that it sort of provides a broad categorization, at least 4 clear typologies of party funding are found in the literature. Public funding, for instance, and then Professor Kasnali have already touched on this. My colleague Heather here will touch on private, and then there is a mixed typology. And of course some authors would also include illicit types, which I personally do not subscribe to. I find it a bit I can't align with it. Illicit funding is illicit funding. It cannot be a regime type, because if you're talking about typologies of political funding, you're talking about a systems and means in which that act of pulling resources together is regulated, is administered. So we are not in the business of regulating illicit funding. To me, this is akin to corruption. You can't say corruption is a critical cog in supply chain management. It is, an anomaly, something that we cannot glorify. And therefore, I sharply disagree with most scholars who then include illicit funding as a typology. Having said that, I also, especially in my chapter or article, make a distinction between political finance and political funding. I believe that there's a huge distinction. We often make a mistake of conflating the two. Political finance and political funding are not the same. But without contradicting myself, I have to hasten to say, political finance is a superstructure, is the overarching of what we are talking about, because it is about the legal and, of course, in this case, other means. I have already said illegally, illicit is not, but of course, it also touches on that. Whereas political funding, which at least in my chapter I stick to, is about the income side of political finance. And if I was to argue in the context of a South Africa case study, I would say we deal with political funding and not necessarily political finance, broadly speaking. And this, as you'll hear from my colleagues, is one of the things that I think bring in contradictions within our own political funding regime in South Africa. And Nkoko, I'm sure, will touch on some of those contradictions. But let me just quickly move, Chair, to then talk about the trajectory of change, which is part of the topic of my article. To say that, political funding is a new subject relatively, because you started seeing most of it in the literature after the Second World War. And at that time, you previously had funding that was based on membership subscription to political organizations. So the people were the source of funding, they were the lifeline to political activities. But then there were soon transitions where you now begin to see this evolve from around the 1960s to 1970s, where the introduction of the welfare policies sort of, in my view, blurred the ideological purity of political funding. So, whereas you previously had ideology as the rallying point in the space, that shift then sort of neutralized ideology as a rallying point. And you also see an increase of competition. That also then led to the scarcity of financial support to political parties. And this transition, therefore, also had an implication of altering the very nature of political organizations, from being mass parties, or parties that are rooted in communities, to parties that become then catch-all parties. In recent political discourse in South Africa, I've always heard people talking about broad churches and so forth. But really, that concept derives from the point when the ideological purity was neutralized, so to speak, and then parties are forced by the circumstances around them to then adopt a broad church, as we like saying, but really a catch-all kind of character. But there was also then, as a result of the changing political landscape, another shift where political parties, having hitherto considered themselves as private entities, began to embrace the idea that they are, after all, public entities. And I think our political leaders, even to date, still struggle with that, dichotomy. That when it suits them, they are private. When they want to attack the IEC for money, they are public. So that is really the legacy of what I'm talking about. And so, because then they began to see themselves as public entities, you also then have a direct link between a political party and the state. And so that's the transition in that trajectory that I'm trying to portray this afternoon. And this is where then the idea of public funding then becomes solidified. But not only that, you see, the entrenchment then of party political business, and that nexus between that and the state, brings another element or attribute of political parties, that which then ensures that parties are going to stick to power by all means, and basically sustaining themselves through the fiscus. So in Western Europe, you then see the emergence of the phenomenon of cartel party systems. So the cartel theory speaks to that. That political parties, even those that sharply disagreed on policy, all of a sudden become, of course, strange bedfellows, so long as the fiscus is at their disposal to sustain their business. Now, what I'm saying, therefore, Chair, is that the various coping strategies that political parties, embraced or developed over time have also been manifest if you look at the electoral system's design. We now have the electoral reform panel. And when you listen to the arguments for either or of the different reform or rather the electoral system regime. At the center of that is this evolution, the trajectory I'm talking about, of parties seeking to also then fashion a political or a electoral system that sustains that a view that they are public entities and therefore do not want to be divorced from the state. So that has an implication on the electoral system design. It also has an implication on party systems. Party systems, simply put, being the relationships and interrelationships between and among political parties and other actors. So, ladies and gentlemen, it is no accident that in that space you then see South Africa also transitioning to coalition politics, where, as part of shaping that party system, parties are now warming up to the idea that for us to continue benefiting from this fiscus, we need to get to public office through the ballot, which is the responsibility of Chairperson Moyapa, or through coalitions. So it's quite an irony that people will lose elections but still be in power. It is in the process of that evolution, the trajectory of political funding that we're talking about. So the ranked seeking theory then it really explains why this is the case. Let me conclude, Chair. The rest of the arguments are in the volume. I therefore would like to conclude as follows: that of course it goes without saying that political funding is essential for democracy. We can argue for that. But I would also argue that the historical, socio-economic, and political legacies, in other words, especially in the context of Africa, where I would argue that cartel parties are not yet the norm, but we are going in that direction. Those factors are going to prolong the institutionalization of political funding. In other words, some of the challenges that I believe the HSRC will point out and Nkoko will share in terms of our experiences as the country are also, impacted by the historical socio-economic conditions that have not yet been resolved. So we're trying to resolve one aspect of the body politic, but not having resolved others as we move forward. Now, I've already said that then this has also a direct impact on party systems. Lastly, I would argue that political funding is not really just a product of a pragmatic reaction, as I was saying, over time, but it is also truly a product of rent-seeking tendencies of political parties. To say they are in it to seek office, they are in it also to make sure that they can maximize on the regime, the regimes that are available at their disposal. So sometimes when we engage robustly on these things, we need to understand that this thing comes from many years ago and it has evolved over time. But it is also not just a genuine evolution. It is also an engineered, deliberately engineered process, as we argue in the volume. Chair, I thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sharia. I think this issue around illicit flows and illicit funding warrants probably more research. And I think this is going to become even more visible with issues like cryptocurrency. People are talking about cryptocurrency has new forms of funding. So maybe a special issue of the general of the GAE. I'm looking at you and you obviously. But thank you so much. And I realize that you're all equipped with micro, so you can wish to sit where you are or you can choose to come to the lectern, whatever you feel more comfortable. So thank you, Victor, for setting the scene and providing some very thought-provoking issues, especially around financing and funding of, which I think is very important. So we've got now Professor Dirk Godze. If you want to, yeah, excellent. So democracy, elections, and political funding, 10 minutes, but you stayed within the 10 minutes.
Chair, and the IEC Commission. I think it's always a pleasure to have you all together. It's for us when you are here, it's quite unique. I think if you are in Cape Town or in Durban or so, they just think about the idea, but it's not reality. I also want to mention that last year was, in my mind, an excellent year for the IEC in terms of events like this. This the one in Durban, the one in Cape Town about possible electoral voting also. So I think that the IEC sees itself much more than just an election management board, body, but also being quite leading in these type of activities and publications. So from my side, as an academic at UNISA, I think we are very grateful for the role of the IEC in this respect. And I hope the election is going well later this year. We have now a date. Now, the chair said elections is expensive. I wonder if that's true. Because it relates to what we are talking about and this volume also of the journal. Because if that is true, does it then mean that low level, developed, underdeveloped, whatever word you want to use, countries can't be democratic? Well, only highly developed countries can be democratic because they have the money for it. So should we not rethink this concept? Especially for parties who say always they don't have enough money. Is it possible, think about it, when COPE was first participated in 2009, they didn't qualify for public funding. Thereafter, the EFF, MK, they didn't. And they still, MK received 14%, the EFF, what was it, 8%, COPE 7%. So there's not a direct correlation between them necessarily. No. It's about other things also, over and above money. Now, my article deals with very much funding and how it relates to democracy. Now, I think the logic that's accepted by most is that the more funding there is, the more democratic it is, as we are saying. But I think we have to challenge that, or at least reinvestigate it, whether that is indeed always the case. Because that means that by implication, political contestation or electoral contestation will always be on an unequal level. Because no parties have equal money available. So does it mean, therefore, that an election is by implication biased? There's not a level equal playing field. And if that's the case, can it be in any imagination be democratic? So I think these are some of the aspects that we, and especially when the Parliament must decide on in future, because I think they have to do it, to revisit the party funding model that is being used in South Africa at the moment. But to get to the point of that, what I wrote about, why should parties be funded in the first instance? And why should they be funded in order to contribute to democracy or be themselves democratic? Because that's the last point I'm going to get to. The first point about money and about funding, in especially elections, but also in between elections, is that obviously it enhances party activities. It makes them stronger competitors They have more resources available, so they can do more when it comes to, for example, elections. It enhances, therefore, by implication, contestation. Now, in political science, there's one of the old theorists about it, Robert Dahl, says there's two components in electoral elections: contestation and diversity. Yeah, so the more contestation there is and the more diversity is, the contenders, the more democratic it will be at the moment. So it contributes to that element of contestation. It also enables better communication. There's more means available of communication. Why is communication important? For the parties, it's important to convey their message. But for us, as the voters, it's important to be informed. Because we again work with the theory, and I'm now borrowing from your theories about, for example, rational choice theory. And that is that you can only take a decision as if you are fully informed and know the consequences of the different choices. And that is what parties are supposed to do, to present their options to the public in general in the best possible way, and they will argue they need money for that. So that is the positive side of how resources, financial resources, can be used by political parties in order to be able to enhance the quality of democracy or the quality of elections, and at the same time for us as the public to be in a better position to be able to make our decisions. What's the negative side of this? It can entrench political inequalities because parties that are smaller, that are less financed, that don't have all the possibilities or the options, they can simply not compete with parties that are well funded. So the playing field is not equal. Even in terms of the law, it is equal. In terms of the regulations of the election, in terms of the Electoral Act, it is equal. But when it comes to the practical side of it, then it is not equal. And I'm not talking now about South Africa, but it's all over the world. The majority party of the previous election is going to benefit in this election because, especially if there's public funding. Because what does public funding, like in our case, our formula is saying, it's based on the proportional representation in the National Assembly or the National Parliament and the provincial legislatures. Remember, not local. Remember, our election is coming at local level. But what does it do? It is based on the election results of 5 years ago. So if in between that 5 years, that party is the majority party, lost massive support, they are still going to be funded in terms of the previous elections' high levels. So it's a distortion. You can argue it as you want. It is a distortion in terms of it. So smaller up-and-coming parties must actually do much more from a democratic point of view in order to be able to be on a level playing field. Now, I think I haven't seen much being done about it, but when it comes to political or party funding, especially for elections, I think two things must be taken into account because that influence, for example, the type of campaigns that political parties can design or can use at the time of elections. And that is their support base. What is their socioeconomic standing? Are they a workers' party? Are they a party of businesses? Are they a middle-class party? Are they a party? So what is the socioeconomic profile of the typical supporters of those parties? If they are in the low-income group, who's going to donate? So there's limited possibilities for donations. If you come from a party which is linked to corporates and to other type of family trusts and all sorts of things, the potential pool for funding for that party is just much more. Again, there's sort of inequalities that is present in that. Then, what about the country per se? If you are a middle income country like South Africa or above middle income country, there's a much higher level of industrial development and economic development, and the potential for corporates to be able to to give some donations to political participants like political parties. If you are a low level income country, it's not there. The potential is not there. The reserves are not there in order to participate in the donation of the political and electoral processes. So what we are seeing is that in countries where there is a higher level of income, can talk about developed countries if you want, party funding for elections tend to be more private. If you are in countries with low levels of socioeconomic development or GDP, much of the funding is public funding. And then the private sector is not so much involved in that. Now I want to conclude, because I want to stay within my 10 minutes, with 3 additional issues. The first one is foreign funding, the big no-no for many. There's unfortunately, one can say, there's no consensus about it on the international level. 53 countries allow it, foreign funding. 127 not. We are one of them. But also qualified. There are some gaps. When I was at the portfolio committee, I identified one of the gaps and they closed their eyes for it. And it's still not in the act. And that is that foreign parties can fund South African parties. Foreign governments are not allowed, but there are nothing about parties. So the potential, especially for security reasons, is very high. We've seen it with manipulation, with cybersecurity issues, but also of purely funding political parties. The fact that the vice president of the US was in Hungary just before the election, it's maybe not funding, but in terms of the sort of the international community's understanding of what is a fair election process and foreign direct or indirect involvement, there might be some questions about that. Another point which I think some other authors and presenters might talk about is specifically the South African model concentrates on funding as a form of income, as a form of revenue. But you can look at the funding point of view also as a form of expenditure. And for example, in the UK, they've concentrated on the UK process. Because if it is difficult to manage a level playing field in terms of party funding in the form of donations and other forms of it, and there's not proper declarations of it to the IEC, and I think the IEC, if you have a private moment, you will say, I guess it's not as good as it should be, if it's just putting it politely. Then the other way is to say, but maybe a better way of creating a level playing field is to say, but let's put a threshold on the expenditure side. That parties can have as much money as they like, but they are only allowed, or candidates allowed to spend a certain amount of money as a maximum threshold per election. That works well when you have single candidates, like in wards or in constituencies. I think it's a more problematic concept when you deal with proportional representation. My last point is, we talk about democracy and we look outwards. I would challenge political parties who are here also about looking inwards, about internal democracy, that you have the money and you have your own party processes, own party congresses, or national conferences, or federal congresses, or so. And there's campaigning happening there. How democratic are these internal processes from a funding point of view? Our legislation says very little about that. I wonder if, for example, at that event in Durban, I remember what the promise of the Minister of Finance. If that is materialized, but you say a party can get money, public funding, but then you are regulated in terms of your internal democratic practices. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Kotze. I think you challenge us to, although we realize that elections and democracy costs, but it's important to sort of think beyond that. And I think here it's very important to engage citizens and voters to understand about dialogue, about your type of engagement and the quality of democracy and the quality of engagement, which brings us back to making sure that democracy matters. So thank you for challenging us to go beyond just the money factor and understand that democracy is something much larger. It's a political, it's a social project where everyone should be involved. So I'd now like to invite Dr. Mchunu, sorry, my mispronunciation. I come from a part of the world that is, your paper speaks to political funding in South Africa, a critical assessment of regulation, a very fundamental issue that we've been discussing since this morning, how regulation can help towards creating that level playing field. And I think, what you mentioned, Professor Kotze, smaller parties that very often get crowded out. So how can regulation create that system, strategies, and impact? So you've got 10 minutes, so the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, colleagues. Good afternoon. Yes, my name is Ngapeli Mchunu, very much related to the minister. I'm joking. Yes, I've got the pleasure of presenting our findings, but before I do that, I'd like to acknowledge the CEO, the commissioners, and all senior key stakeholders from the commission. Also, I'd like to acknowledge the editor-in-chief of the journal and the guest editors. Yeah, we really had a hard time dealing with the comments because they were not compromising at all. So it's good to see that the work we put in is finally in print. So our paper essentially looks at public evaluation of democracy, but also of how financing of elections works. So one might ask, why is it so important that we do public opinion research on democracy? It is important because democracy is the will of the people. It requires the buy-in of citizens, not necessarily of academics, scholars, citizens. If we have, for example, 25 million people who are eligible for voting or who could vote, but only 1 million vote, we would have a democratic illegitimacy purely because citizens have not engaged in the process. So it becomes very difficult for us to ensure that we do capture the voices and the sentiments of local South African citizens, simply because it is their democracy after all. Methodologically, we used data from the South African Social Attitude Survey. This particular survey is nationally representative and it goes to field every year, annually. It asks a range of questions pertaining to democracy, satisfaction with democracy, and this particular module was a specialized module focusing solely on party funding and citizen sentiments towards that effect. The data, as I said, is nationally representative. The population is benchmarked to follow Stats SA media population estimates. And the sampling and random sampling ensures that, firstly, we do not have any replacements. So if the sample picks a certain participant, we do not replace. We go back maybe for 2 or 3 occasions. We also, of course, try and ensure that we compare a lot of our data to other research institutions, such as Afrobarometer. They also have surveys similar to ours. And generally, historically, the findings have not been dissimilar. So most of what we've been able to capture has also kind of been highlighted and emphasized by other institutions of public opinion research. So I'll just stick to a few key findings here. So firstly, there is a strong disconnect between what we as researchers and scholars would think is happening on the ground and what is actually happening on the ground. Generally, South Africans are not as engaged politically as one would like to assume. So, for example, about 40% of people have said that they do not engage in any political conversations or discourse of any kind. So this has resulted in a finding of about 58% of our participants said they'd never heard of the Multi-Party Democracy Fund. That is, of course, a very high figure. However, we also saw that of the study participants, nearly 3/4, that about 74%, said that they were not willing to donate to the Multi-Party Democracy Fund. Now, one might ask, why is that the case? We must remember that as far as finance, politics, governance goes, it all happens within the context of what is happening in the country. South Africans are becoming less and less trusting. State institutions are not as trusted as they were before. So it is then, therefore, not surprising that political parties and that citizens will be unwilling to donate to anything politics related because of the mistrust that has since crept into our current public discourse. So institutions have not been spared, local governments, etc., etc. So that is why there is that strong unwillingness. Then we have to look, for example, though, at whether or not citizens would support a mechanism of this nature. And what we found is that that is certainly the case. 42% of our participants support the act, the Political Party Funding Act, while there's only 14 oppose it. This speaks to a desire and appetite for transparency. But if there isn't enough knowledge, that transparency, as admirable as it is, will not necessarily do or make the kind of difference it could potentially make. But we've also found that South Africans are worried about the potential capture of the electoral system. So we found that about 37% of our participants were very worried about potential capture. And we found that 33% were somewhat worried. So there is a huge worry regarding whether or not our elections and electoral systems are captured by elite forces. But this then takes us back to the Multi-Party Democracy Fund. The Multi-Party Democracy Fund essentially ensures that elections do not take place in an overly unequal playing field. South Africa is notoriously unequal, one of the most unequal societies in the world. However, the Multi-Party Democracy Fund gives citizens a voice. It gives citizens a platform. And one could argue potentially it gives smaller parties the platform to potentially canvass and mobilize its supporters without necessarily relying or accessing huge funding. But the transparency issue we spoke of is also not going to occur in isolation. We have seen, particularly since the reporting period began, political parties have not always come to the party as far as declaring their donations. There have been many occasions where political parties have been unwilling to declare, and they've been unwilling to share exactly where their funds came from and who is funding certain political activities. Now, that is not something you can legislate, because what you want to end up doing is you're just going to end up having a country that is so overly regulated, it becomes impossible to move forward with anything. Therefore, this particular concern regarding political party capture can only be resolved if parties are able to declare where exactly do they get their funding from. We then also said that in terms of understanding the public sentiment matters because we have a reaction. The society reacts based on what it believes. I always make this example regarding the myth of if you don't vote, your vote will go to a political party or the dominant political party. In our case, that being the ANC. But we all know there is a myth. But are we able to understand where the myth comes from? And are we able to properly distill and understand why citizens think like that? The reason citizens think like that is that generally, if a political party commands huge support, low turnouts, or if people do not vote, may not necessarily hurt that political party as much because it already has a huge base of voters. While as smaller political parties are more likely to be affected because their voter base is much smaller. So essentially, if one does not turn out to vote, the incumbent or the dominant party is likely to feel the negative effects the least relative to emerging political parties. So, and that is exactly why, with the Political Party Funding Act, we are seeing that that level of distrust and that level of voter apathy or lack of voter confidence is affecting how citizens respond to political party funding. Of course, the public discourse becomes important. We've heard many debates and conversations regarding political parties and how they're funded and certain elections, sometimes even internal party elections. Those sort of concerns arise from the reality and the realization that, unfortunately, due to what has been happening in the country with allegations of state capture, the Madlang Commission, etc., there is now this huge worry and concern that the elections may be up for capture, or certain rich people or people who have means will capture elections. This becomes important to address because when we talk about the Political Party Funding Act, citizens must know what it's able to do, what it's not able to do, where does it work, or how does it work. But because we're living in an era of misinformation and populism, we begin to see that not all the information that is distilled in the public is actually true. You find, we have just heard the announcement of the LGE 2026 on the 4th of November. But you'll also hear or read about political parties making certain allegations, saying certain things about the IEC as an EMP. Those sort of sentiments are critical in ensuring that they are countered, and if there's any misinformation or populism, that has to be dealt with. But what we're finding in our data is that there are huge levels of distrust, and that and in some instances of misinformation, they are now affecting whether or not the Political Party Funding Act, along as the Multi-Party Democracy Fund, is going to be evaluated correctly. Now, in closing, I just want to emphasize that some of the recommendations we've made pertaining to increasing awareness has to do with civic education, not just voter education, because more often than not, we tend to use the two interchangeably. Voter education is specifically for the process of voting, while a civic education encompasses everything related to whether it's an election or taking part, or maybe even the funding of a political party, and knowing exactly how the political spectrum works. This becomes important so that we can counter misinformation and populism. Because unlike before, where you had a monopolized access to information and news sharing, you now, through social media, you now have citizens or people who are able to spread information or misinformation without necessarily being held accountable. So this means that matters such as that of the Political Party Funding Act need to be countered through constant civic education. Another recommendation we made was that there needs to be more engagements, particularly with young people as well. And one might ask, why is there such a special emphasis on young people? One, firstly, the country is relatively young as far as population goes. But secondly, the future of the country's democracy does not rest with senior citizens, it rests with young people. So if young people are not necessarily aware of all the mechanisms that are available as far as the Party Funding Act goes, there is likely to be continued disengagement, which does not help. Which does not help the country or the IC or all other stakeholders. And then the last recommendation was that we need to ensure that we remember that the Act is not necessarily the branch. It's not the IEC's baby. It's everyone's baby. It's not just the EMP that has to make sure that the Act is being abided by. Political parties, civil society organizations, citizens themselves, across the board, have a responsibility of ensuring that we understand what the Act is about. And even if we are of the view that the Act is not perfect, we at least know what exactly is to be done to fix any part or aspect of the Act. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I think these are very, very important points that you've highlighted. Public sentiment, matters. Very often we have a tendency to sort of knock on the doors of voters just on the eve of election, and between just forget them. So I think, factor in what causes disconnect is extremely important. Why people have distrust in systems, political systems, and sometimes electoral system. And obviously this whole new era of disinformation, misinformation, fake news, been increasingly talking about deepfakes, and now how we enter into an era of artificial intelligence, how they can systematically sort of endanger, elections and the quality of elections. And I think just like you mentioned about, moving away from top down, going internal, political parties, your presentation and the paper focuses on bottom up approaches, engaging people into those political conversations where their voices can be factored in. And I think, the gap has been shown in many countries across the world that political literacy is very low among voters, citizens. So this is really an opportunity to sort of get them into the conversation. And thank you for these great insights. So now we move on to our fourth presentation, Mr. Nkoko from the Electoral Commission of South Africa, and you'll be talking about implementation of political funding, successes, and I like that word, successes, because we have a tendency to always talk about problems, and so successes, let's share successes, challenges, and lessons learned. So the floor is yours.
Okay. Professor Kasanali, thank you very much. Let me thank you as the moderator of this session, but also I think your role as the chief editor. It's a beautiful piece of work that you have done along with your editorial team. But I'd also like to, I think, also representing my manager, Mr. George Mahlangu, with whom we authored this paper together. I would like to acknowledge the commissioners, the CEO, and the executive management for allowing us this opportunity to contribute to the intellectual discourse. And I need to emphasize, without censorship, the opinions that are here, which are contributing to the intellectual, discourse, are our own. No one asked, why are you questioning the commission's work or not? And that, I think, needs to be acknowledged and appreciated. I think it encourages future contribution. Thank you very much. And to ladies and gentlemen and everybody present in this room, greetings to you as well. Our paper, coming from, we are at the belly, inside the belly of the beast. We are implementing this regulation, we are implementing this legislation, and therefore our contribution comes from that point of view. Hence, we are looking at implementing the Act, looking at where we have been successful, what challenges have been experienced, and lessons learned from this. So we examine, as indicated, the implementation of this legislation over the first 4 years of implementation. This legislation came into effect on the 1st of April 2021, and over the last 4 years, it has been a route less traveled. In fact, a route never traveled, if I may put it that way, into this particular country. Now, it evaluates how the Act has shaped transparency, accountability, and democratic consolidation. I think without doubt, we can agree that, political funding as it is implemented in this country, this is the first time, and therefore contributes to democratic consolidation. I think that which was started a few years ago in 1996 or with the first legislation in 1997, where public funding was the only one that was regulated and nothing about private funding was regulated. It's a major step forward. Therefore, we are grateful that we are sharing this information. Now, just methodologically, we adopted a qualitative interpretive approach, meaning that we looked at the work that we do ourselves and have documented, the work that's contributed by research done by various scholars. The Human Sciences Research Council has done a bit of work on the space, yes, commissioned by the Electoral Commission itself. We looked at contribution from civil society. There are multiple institutions in this country, among them My Vote Counts, who are actually keeping us on our toes. We put something out, they question it, there is discourse, there is engagement. So would like to really acknowledge all that. So that's the information that we worked with to present our views and to put this paper together. But also the symposium that was hosted, everybody has acknowledged the symposium that was hosted last year by the Commission in Durban. That body of knowledge, I think it's very, very important, and I think it will, it will continue to impact, in many ways has shaped the thinking around political funding in this country. And therefore, work that came from there was very, very important to then, contextualize in order to be able to get a nuanced analysis around this particular issue. Going into the findings that our study, that our paper has made and reflection on successes, the first one and very key is the institutionalization aspect. The Commission has been able to institutionalize this with whatever limited resources. The unit that implements this from the Commission's point of view, it's a very small unit, but it's pushing to really put this legislation to effect. So now, that institutionalization aspect, I think, has been a major, major success to the point that, we are able to have this conversation, political parties and information is put out there, for the public to engage. The second area of success that this paper speaks to is transparency. On a quarterly basis, without fail, and at the time this paper was put out, more than 16 quarterly disclosure reports, which, by the way, become very, very, I think, areas of interest to media in general. You look at social media, you look at print media, it's conversation around who has funded who, how much is making rounds, and who exactly is it that seems to be having the large purse. So that issue of transparency and putting information out there without fail on a quarterly basis, as per regulation, is one area of success that if you look at the paper, you'll get more details around. The further issue is the one on system development. I'm referring here about various systems that we've been able to put into place, and this paper reflects on those, including the online political funding system. First of a kind, inborn, created by the Commission itself to assist transparency political parties to report on this. That's a major area because it's even recognized internationally. The Transparency International report refers to the South African system, political funding system, being the only one that, I think, compared to various others, that is accessible online and so forth. Now, that acknowledges the area of success in terms of the systems development and the ability to, search the information online for accessibility. The issue of policy coherence, very, very important. You look at where the Constitution began around funding of political parties in Section 236 of the Constitution, and you follow through with various pieces of legislation that followed. Yes, the legislation that only focused on public funding, but then it evolved, of course, as a result of various other interventions, some of them litigious and all of that, or based on litigation. But there has been, progression towards making sure that the principles of openness, the principles of, right of association, political rights, you can see them building through, and I think it's an area that the paper recognized as a measure of success, the whole issue of policy coherence. Of course, the issue of international recognition. I have made reference to, Transparency International report, which was published last year. It does demonstrate that South Africa's model is indeed making contribution to the international stage. Earlier, my colleague Victor Shale spoke about various funding models, the public dominant, the private dominant, and the mixed model. South Africa is running ahead on that mixed model where there is public funding, there is multi-party democracy fund, which is about bringing money from the private sector to inject into the political space. So in that area, South Africa, I think, is standing head above many when you compare both regionally in the SADC region and internationally. So all those are major areas of success that the paper reflects on quite extensively. Of course, there are no successes without challenges. Among them is the resource constraints that the paper reflects on. And it talks about, I started with the size of the unit and its ability to perform certain functions, which the paper reflects on quite extensively. Among them is the limited investigation capability, which is an area that even in the recommendations, the paper does reflect on and so forth. Not only that, the legislation itself, I indicated that the legislation only came into effect in 2021. It's the first of its kind in this country, and it's got a number of challenges, a number of ambiguities, and those are reflected there in terms of, how the legislation creates enforcement challenges, the issues of penalties that may not be fully as effective. A political party that fails to, comply gets to be fined a minuscule amount of 40,000 rand as an example. All those challenges are reflected there, and just the issues of legal, limitations around the legal aspects. We speak about, the paper speaks about compliance gaps, where in a country like South Africa that has more than 500 political parties registered, and many of them are not funded by the state, have to rely on funding from members or from individual owners, there is always going to be a challenge with regard to compliance. Those are some of the challenges that are reflected in the paper, to say that there are major compliance gaps, largely stemming from these political parties that can be referred to as smaller, but largely unrepresented, as it were. The issue of public awareness is reflected again as a or lack of public awareness. Very low levels. Dr. Mkhunu basically spoke to low percentages, I think around 54%. The paper reflects on those issues to say, if the public is not very aware of this space of work, area of work, how then are political parties meant to be kept, to account? How is the electorate engaging political parties on the very issue of political funding, which is quite critical? And then the issue, some of them are structural issues, dominance of major political parties, as well as wealthy donors that really, are in the driving seat, if I may put it that way. Those are some of the challenges that are recognized, that the legislation, in the manner in which it is crafted, allows for such to happen. And those challenges are some of those that must be considered as we develop the policy going forward in the legislative environment. Lessons learned, we could argue, and I think various pieces of work that we analyzed demonstrated that transparency mechanisms have boosted public confidence in a number of areas. Although they do recognize poor enforcement and lack of inclusivity largely referring to the local sphere of government, where political parties that are playing in the local sphere of government are not included in the funding scheme, public funding scheme of this particular legislation. Those issues are noted quite significantly in the paper. Thank you. Okay, this is my last two slides. Yes. The issue of adaptability I spoke about, and the fact that South Africa does illustrate complexity of institutionalizing transparent political financing in emerging democracies. That is critically one of the areas that have been identified. But just in conclusion, the Political Funding Act, as the paper demonstrates, has advanced democracy, advanced transparency and accountability. But largely, the dual role of the Electoral Commission, both as an electoral management body and a funding regulator, this is a very contested issue, and some question the issue of capacity and therefore impartiality in that regard. Lastly, we would like to, the paper basically highlights that the framework is regionally progressive, yet still evolving, and of course it's vulnerable to risks such as digital campaigning, the cryptocurrency issues as was spoken about. But that's really the areas that going forward need to be focused on. There are certain recommendations that are made in terms of going forward. One would be the strengthening enforcement capacity, integrating technology into disclosure system, expanding civic education, and paper basically agrees with the concept of civic education as opposed to voter education, because this is beyond voter education. Refining legal framework and promoting inclusivity. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm sorry for rushing you, but we're mindful of time. If we had all the time in the world, it would have been perfect. But thank you. I think these are best practices that can be shared with other countries, because I think this body of practice is so important, because successes are to be shared. So we'll now move on to Heather. You've got 10 minutes and you'll be speaking about corporate funding of politics, because we still have our respondent who will, and Q&A time. So
I'll try not to be 10 minutes. How's that? Okay. I do want to say thank you very much to the IEC for inviting me to participate in the seminar in Durban last year, but also to be part of this particular volume. As an academic, you always have fun times when somebody offers you the opportunity to publish and not ask you to pay to publish. So we're very grateful. Article publishing fees for academics are very expensive. So anytime you could do it for free, we're very happy. So thank you very much for that. Thank you also to EISA. 30 years old, congratulations on that. You have grown with this democracy, and you've grown stronger, or you've helped us grow stronger as well. So thank you very much for that. Having said that, I would like to just sort of a few notes. Thank you to the former presenters here, and I would like to pick up on a couple of things that they've said as well in my paper, because it's kind of interesting that I came last on the panel. But as Dr. Mkhunu says, that there is a lack of public awareness amongst the public, obviously, about the legislation. My particular brief was to look at what corporates do. And corporates are not, shall we say, passive, but they do not lack literacy. They read the law very carefully, not just in South Africa, but across the world, and they know exactly how to use the legislation for their own benefits. And so my task was interesting, but also very difficult, because there's also very little data out there. So let me just give you an outline of the core argument. As was mentioned earlier, the PPFA, the legislation that governs this, that was enacted in 2018, but only came into force in 2021, created disclosure obligations of a certain reporting threshold. At the time, it was 100,000 Rand, and established the IEC as the oversight authority. The intention was clear. The idea was to make corporate political funding visible, and in doing so, to reduce the capacity for undue influence. Corporates are very smart. But corporate political engagement has adapted around the legislation rather than complying fully with it. So the study found that comprehensive rules have produced counterintuitive outcomes. And this is something also with the legislation. As perfect as it is, there are always loopholes. And corporates, their job is to find those loopholes and to try and see where it is. Not to break the law, but to see how they can operate within the loopholes of the law. So the behavior technically meets the letter of the law, but it also systematically undermines the purpose of it. The theoretical explanation for this is that political finance operates in a complex adaptive system. Okay, I didn't lose everybody just yet. I'll explain what that is, but it's a set of the way that actors look, they observe the regulatory environment, they learn from it, and they adapt and evolve their strategies in response to it. And this is something legislation doesn't keep pace with. It sits down, it's there, it sits as the letter of the law, but it doesn't maneuver around it. It's very difficult, it's very expensive, and it's very inflexible in that respect. And this is how corporate funders have taken the opportunity to look at the blind spots and maneuver within it. So after some academic gymnastics, which you are welcome to read in the edition of the journal, I won't go through it here, I'll show you what the evidence came up with. So there are 3 corporate behavior patterns that consistently emerged across the data. The first is that corporations comply minimally. They disclose only what the law compels them to do. The second thing is that they, and I say this as corporate because my paper was supposed to be on corporate, but this is not solely what corporate donors do. Individual donors do this as well. Other corporates, or shall we say donors, creatively structure their donations so that they fall just below the threshold. Oh, and by the way, the political parties that are present here, this is not meant as a playbook for you to circumvent the law, okay? So they give just less than the threshold, so they don't have to be disclosed. The other thing is they work with political parties, and they calculate the minimum fine, which in this case was 40,000 Rand, and they realize that minimum fine for not disclosing is far less of an incentive or a disincentive for us to give to the political party. So they work in collusion in that. Clearly, the incentive structure scheme needs to be reworked and needs to be looked at to make it into a more flexible idea. But at the same moment that we're working at this, the state's commitment to oversight has also been eroded. The IEC has been the major, I don't want to say benefactor of this because I can't think of the English word right now, but you've been implicated, hampered by this, shall we say. So over the last, I think between 2023 and 2025, and I stand corrected, you've lost about 800 million in your budget. But now you're being asked to also conduct oversight. So no wonder your investigative abilities have been eroded. Where's the money coming from? How are you supposed to do this? And then the weeks before the 2024 election, Parliament passed the Electoral Matters Amendment Bill, which effectively suspended the disclosure requirements completely. So there's a lot of burden, there's structural failure, but the practical implication is stark. Without understanding how these dynamics, how players play in this particular sandbox, regulators will continue to design rules that are well-resourced but routinely outmaneuvered. And this is what the whole thrust of the paper was about. There's a lot more to it. You can have some fun with it, but short and sweet. Thank you. Okay.
Thank you so much for keeping to time. And I think, you talk about, and these are corporates across the continent that use that, using loopholes of the law, undue influence. And I think that culture of collusion is something that we recurrently see in many countries across the continent. So I'll now invite Professor Sithold for her her role as respondent. You've got 10 minutes, and then we'll open up for Q&A and then the votes of them. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Program Director. I would like to express appreciation for being here and express a lot of jealousy for not having been part of the Durban Symposium, which I see had a lot of rigor in terms of debate. I will also stand on the protocol of the greetings that have been done, and possibly not take my entire 10 minutes because a lot of richness is in this journal and it has been expressed. But I wanted to just paint an emerging picture, an overall emerging picture from the wonderful work that has been done. If I had to title this, I would have said money became the point. Alternatively, I would have said resources are political, because that is the picture that is emerging from all of the work that has been presented here. First of all, I wanted to perhaps say that the nuts and bolts and cleanliness over logistics and transparency that is coming through as the role of electoral commissions, because we are using ours to project that, is actually appreciated and must continue to be enforced, even if we all cry out verbarian rigidity and all of these things that we can cry out, because it becomes the basis of engagement that is transparent, especially with this subject matter having a potential for conflict, actually. So all of the things that are coming out of here in relation to the Act, enforcing the fact that it becomes the basis of transparency, even of dividing the meager resources that are available, is something to applaud and emphasize. Having said that, secondly, I wanted to say that there are stakes related to the citizen that we need to dig, because it's funding, yes, and we are talking about funding the logistics of election in a way that will not get us into a quagmire of conflict. But the other things that we read about in newspapers, that we see in the news, about the apathy of the citizen, the voter, the gloominess of the youth, need to be discussed as stakes where the investment is not necessarily, and the effort is not necessarily yielding a concomitant result. And so we need to ponder upon the social cohesion of our society, coupled with the promise of development aspirations that is not, that we're not gaining as the return of investment. And I'm not only talking about political party funding, I'm talking about all of us here, because we are that investment. Thirdly, I wanted to say that the alienation itself, particularly for the South African society, that is resulting from some of the promises of the Constitution not being fulfilled, the structural redress that is not happening, needs to receive the attention directly in terms of investment. You might want to argue that I'm digressing from political funding, but it is a kind of society that has invested in the ability for people to thrive, that will have citizens that appreciate the meager dividends of political parties and be able to restore the issues of ideology. One of the speakers spoke about how democracy was grounded in ideological competitiveness, even if they did not use those words. Fourthly, of five, I also wanted to touch a little bit of the bigger picture, particularly this issue of foreign funding. It's not just foreign funding that is the issue. It's also foreign attention that some countries get and some countries all of a sudden give because they can afford to. When they donate their observers to certain countries and are quite opinionated about certain countries. So there are nations globally who are operating on a ticket of national prowess themselves in terms of what they say about other people's business and what is not said actually about them. And that also includes the fact that the corporates are not innocent. There was a journalist recently who was remarking about the coordination between Washington, D.C. and the Silicon Valley, for example, because the corporates are not innocent. So, in the space of funding and resources, there is a whole lot more that we need to examine, place ourselves in it, and see whether we are the chess or the pawns on the chessboard. And lastly, I wanted to highlight this issue of trajectories. Unless, and maybe this is the last point for a good reason, unless we link funding and the investment and the competition that we have around the aspects of finances and funding, we link that with the trajectories of our society. Where we are we advancing? Are we creating a citizen that is invested with confidence in the system? We are not actually, we will just be doing isolated uh, deliverables, both of writing as well as of the elections themselves. So, in the process of doing this, even if the IEC needs to be focused on logistics and cleanliness, some bodies that work with the IEC need to constantly monitor the trajectories of society if our investment needs to have meaning. Thank you very much for this. I forgive you for not being in Durban.
Thank you so much, Pearl, for those thoughts. And I think something that really retains all our attention, resources remain fundamentally political, obviously. So now we have, 10 minutes or maybe one round, and then we'll see how it goes, of questions or comments. But I would sort of press upon you to make those comments or questions very, very short and concise so that we can pack them more. So let's take a round of maybe 3 questions. So we've got Commissioner Joyce here. Maybe one more at the far end, and then at the furthest end. So 1, 2, 3. So you've got your microphone. Speak to the microphone, please.
Thank you very much, Master of Ceremonies. I would like to thank all the presenters and all these authors for this work, which we have not had a chance to look at, but I'm sure we will be able to read it. My 2 questions are, Professor Kotze indicated that we need to go back to Parliament to look at this political funding law. So I'm interested to find out which part of the Act, which Professor thinks it should be revisited. I also think there needs to be more work on this Act. I would also like to ask my colleague from IEC, Tate Nkuku, if you don't give me money, why should I comply and account to you? I'm talking about all those political parties at that conference which were asking, why should we account to IEC if we are not being given money? Thank you.
Thank you. So we'll go to the second question. Yeah, you've got, please go ahead. Yeah, the person who yeah, you. And then I'll go to the last.
Thank you very much, Program Director. My name is Sean. I'm from the Economic Freedom Fighters, the fastest growing political party in the world. Program Director, mine is on Professor Dick Coetzee as well. I think Professor Dick Coetzee have raised the issue of biasness in the Political Funding Act. which we have always been, which we have always been raising as the EFF, that the unequal distribution of funds does not strengthen multi-party democracy, as it perpetuates political power imbalances by favoring those political parties who already have more political power. In the case of South Africa, the ruling party. I wanted to ask Professor Dick Coetzee on his paper. I believe that he has raised his recommendations, his findings on his paper. But I want to check what were his recommendations. What does he recommend that we must do in terms of that? I think is related to the question, but I want to ask on the paper that is raised. But also want to appreciate the IEC for the research that they've conducted for us. The second question that I have is on the, it also raised that in its current form, this political funding make it illegal for political parties to receive funding from foreign government, except for skills and policy development. And also it makes it, it does not speak on the independent candidates. As we are in local government elections right now, the political party, I think there are barriers to entry from the independent candidates. So it disadvantaged them. So I wanted also to check on the issue of.
That's 3 questions.
No, it's not a question. This one is just to raise there is a form. The formula is clear on the formula based on that is used by the on public funding, but on private funding, we just want to know what are the formulas that are used by the private donor fundings when they are funding political parties, because you've got political parties that like DA who are given a chunk of money by the Friedman Foundations as well as the Oppenheimers. So what criteria, what formula are they using when they are funding a small political party, a large, huge amount of money?
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. And then we'll take the question at the back of the room. There was some person who identified. Yeah, you can go ahead.
No, thank you very much. My name is Lungile from Blind SA. My concern is along they call it independent. Those who are contesting elections as individuals, how do they fund it? Because it seems as if all these papers who are here, they are very quiet in saying, if I'm an independent candidate, I want to stand on my own, how should they be funded by the act itself? So I just want to understand it. And also to raise that if it is quiet, then it needs to be look at how, because South Africa recently in the previous elections, we have amended the act to say I can stand on my own, but how should I be funded by the act? Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. We've got more than 3 questions. There were specific questions, so maybe we take the specific questions, and then if anyone wants to sort of respond to the more generic or larger questions. So I think this one. You can stay where you are. You've got your equipment.
Don't know if you can see me, but.
But you can stand if you wish. I'm sorry.
About revisiting, first of all, the act. I would say there's numerous aspects, and it is, first of all, it is about the enforcement component of it, which at the moment there's very little, well, first of all, the punitive component of it is not really a form of deterrent. So it is, as some of you have said, they make actually deals of how they can absorb whatever type of fine there will be. So that I think is one aspect, is that it's not an act which is seen as something which is serious enough that there's participation in it. Secondly, and unfortunately, I will be treading on toes now. I don't think the IEC is the right agent to do this work. When I was in just before 2018 at the Parliament, we had a whole debate in the parliamentary meetings about this, and afterwards I heard on radio that the IEC had a special session in which they argued in favor of the current dispensation. I thought it's a mistake. Because if the first point about enforcement is strengthened, it's going to compromise the IEC. Because if you say to party A, you haven't met the procedural requirements, and the IEC is the one who must decide what is the punitive component. It doesn't go necessarily to a court. Now you sit in a national liaison committee just before an election, and you say to these parties, oh, there's a dispute, and that's the party is involved in it. And they say, but you were the one who acted against us. How is that? It compromises the IEC. So I think I don't want to take the jobs away from the IEC, but it is something which will have to be, I say, will have to be relooked. Then encouraging the public and big business and so on to contribute to the two funds. There's very little public participation, public cooperation in terms of donating to the funds. We hear all the time the funds are underfunded. So something must be done in terms of incentives, maybe even tax incentives that's given to donors to do that. Is SARS not a cooperation, a partner maybe in this? If they don't disclose, because the auditing process, I think, is also not foolproof, because the parties can have their own auditors. Then they report to the party, to the IEC, and then the Auditor General becomes involved. But there's so many loopholes in it. SARS is now impressive. Is it not possible to pull in SARS? Because they have access to the bank accounts and to all sorts of things. And to say, well, what you do in other aspects, in terms, especially when it comes to, that so-called road unit, as far as I understand, is back at SARS. And that was their main purpose, is to identify not only criminal activity, but also non-compliance. So those will be a few. About the EFF, what will be, what I presented as maybe an unequal playing field. I think the one aspect is what happened in the last readjustment of the regulations for the Act, is that it reduced the equity component of it to a very small percentage. And I think that is something to start with, to deal with, that the equity component of the formula between the proportional and the equity, that should be increased. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Am I audible? Okay, thanks. I'd just like to start with the question on why must I account if I'm not being funded? This must be understood within the context of the legislation, that in the main, it's about protecting the sovereignty of the state. And that also, therefore, touches on who then funds you. If you don't receive the money from the state, you are receiving it from someone else. It's important, therefore, that we know who that person is. And that's where the accountability aspect at least begins. So that's the part about that. I would also just like to touch on a few other issues that have been raised. Among them, the issue of independence and individuals now that the local government elections are coming about. That starts at the constitution level, where only those that are represented in the national and provincial legislatures will be funded by the state. Therefore, I spoke earlier about inclusivity, or lack of rather, which is in our paper. We're saying local government sphere is entirely excluded from public funding. Whether you are represented at a municipal level or not, there shall not be any form of funding coming from the state. And it's an area that the Minister of Finance touched on when we were in Durban. Once again, I'm referring to Professor Stoll, I'm referring to the symposium in Durban, where the minister touched on this issue to say maybe it's an area that needs to be focused on. And it's only at that point that independents and individuals at local government level can be funded. And Professor Kota dealt with the issue of biasness. The formula that favors larger parties and smaller parties. That's an area that I think indeed lies in the legislation and may need to be looked into. I'll leave others to other colleagues. Thanks.
Anyone would like to comment? Right. We'll take one last round of questions. How much time do we have? I know that we. So let's take one round. So we've got one here, and then yeah. So two. Right. So let's take your question.
Yeah, thank you very much, George Mahlangu. I've got one question to Professor Kotze, but before I do so, Prof, we have approached SARS to create an incentives to the contributors into the multi-party democracy fund. Unfortunately, we were not, successful. And I think their take is that political parties themselves, they are non-tax-paying entities. Because what we wanted to do is that corporate, when they contribute to this fund, at least they can get some tax rebate or so. But we were not successful. My question, though, to you, our South African framework is income-based. And you did mention, in your presentation about the expenditure approach. Are you in favor of the expenditure monitoring framework approach? And if yes, why?
Hi, my name is Lebona Rhoda Musima from Inside Politics. So my question is for Dr. Mkunu. Given public skepticism around money in politics, how does the IEC plan to communicate these findings to ordinary voters in an accessible way? Sorry. And then for Mr. Nkonko, will the IEC use findings from the special issue to recommend amendments to the Political Party Finding Act to Parliament before the 2027 elections? And then are there calls in the special issue for an independent body outside the IEC to oversee political funding? And what's the IEC's position on that? Thank you.
Mr. Mahlangu, about whether it's income or expenditure, I don't want to say that it's completely either or, but given the problems that we have at the moment, with compliance, and the fact that there are clearly loopholes in terms of how and it has been presented. I don't have to repeat them. I think we should try to see if the expenditure one is not something which can create more of a level playing field, because then it applies across the board to everyone. It's not that there's then not a distinction between a bigger party and a smaller party. In some of the systems are to say that let's say for local government, there's an X amount, it's the basic sum that can be used by a political party or an individual candidate, plus then, which is a strange concept maybe for us, that the rest is a proportion per voter. So if in a ward there's, let's say, 15,000 voters, then you can have X amount of money per voter that you are allowed to spend, plus the lump sum amount. And that applies across the board to all parties. So it means it's not your performance as a party is not based on how much money you have. It is based on how much you can convince the voter about your cause, about your policy. At the moment, you have this huge, some parties have budgets, apparently have over R1 billion for an election. Others have a handful. How can it be a sort of a equal, relatively equal type of election campaign that is being held, even if all those donations are above board? Thanks.
Thank you very much. The question about whether the commission supports, the establishment of a different entity, I will, base my response on what research has, demonstrated that yes, there is a concern around whether the commission's impartiality is not compromised by, operating as an EMB and a regulator. So there are perspectives out there to say perhaps we could look at, or the legislators, by the way, could look at establishing an inspectorate for political funding. In other countries, there are different entities that are responsible for this particular work, which are separate from the electoral commission or electoral management body, as it were. Now, coming back to whether the commission will approach parliament to propose legislative changes, we believe that work that comes from publications like this and so forth should inform and should influence policy makers, parliamentarians, and so forth, to begin to think about how best do we strengthen this particular area of work. So as more work of this nature gets developed, gets put out there, we believe that those are responsible for drafting the legislation will look at the various viable options. It's not for the commission really to propose this or the other. At this point, we are about implementing the legislation, and we will do it to the best of our ability. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. We've got some more time. I just got Victor mentioned that there's like a couple more minutes. So we will take a third round of questions if there are any. Yeah, 1, 2. Well, we'll try and get people who have not asked questions. So 1. Trying to be inclusive as possible. So you get your chance. So 1, 2. And then if there is time for you, the third one, we will get that. So please go ahead and ask your question. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. Zandi Lepiri from the United Democratic Movement. I do welcome the presentations and everything that has been said and put in front of us. However, one of the comments and the things that I want to raise in the House is the issue of this uneven political funding for the smaller parties and the bigger parties, which is one of the things that we are facing at this current moment. Not forgetting about the independent one, as also they are crying on their corner as well. And then when I've listened to Dr. Mchunu specifically, I was more interested on that presentation, more especially when he looked at the misinformations and the things that have been said by the societies, as well as some of us as the political parties, with the mistrust, as well as looking at the capturing side of things and all that stuff that we normally each and every, which I believe IEC is one of the challenges that they are having. They will have a lot of cases coming from either the society or from us as political parties, and every time when there is an election that is happening. So I would like to find out from him, during his time of research and the time of doing these particular studies, did they find out how best it can be tackled through the voters registration? Because I believe when you speak about the voters registration, I only think it's how you are teaching a person how to vote, not in fact going deeper in such a way that you are informing, trying to find out that, to make sure that people, they understand the ideology of basically what is the Electoral Commission, how does it work, and all to those T's. So do they have any planning, or maybe have they ever came up to discuss on such a level with the IEC, and also on their findings and how they can tackle it, also with those successes that were also spoken about? And is that part of their successes as well, or maybe stories that they can look at deeply so that we can all be in the same page? Thank you.
Right, thank you. The second question? The second hand that went up? Yeah. Yep. Yes, you said. Yes.
Thank you very much. I'm Michael Hendrickson from the IEC in the Western Cape. I'm not speaking on behalf of the Commission. But just two comments. The first one is, I don't think the problem can be solved by creating another institution. I think that we have Chapter 9 institutions for a reason, and those institutions must be strengthened, whether it's the IEC or the Human Rights Commission, to be given the remedial powers that it can enforce. And that is really what is expected of us as the election management body. We are sometimes a referee, and there's nothing stopping referees from issuing red cards. So why should IEC refrain from taking actions against non-compliant parties? Secondly, freedom, free and fair elections. One of the principles is that every vote must be of equal value. And yet, when it comes to these matters of party funding, we have a situation that opinions is not of equal value. That the person who has the resources and who's rich, their opinion matters more than just the ordinary voter. And that is something that we need to look at when we look at donor funding specifically. And what is required is more clearer regulation and better enforcement mechanisms to ensure that at the end of the day, there is not an imbalance in terms of influence on policy. And then lastly, just my question, in as much as we concentrate on political parties and their funding and their funders, what about the surrogates which are being used by parties, where you call them super PACs or NPOs, that are similarly also there, that go out and do their advocacy work, etc., for parties, but they don't fall under the same regime of having to disclose where their funding is coming from and who's their backers. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll take the entertain the gentleman who already asked. Do you want to ask a question? All right. Two? All right. So you can go ahead, and then we'll bring it back to the panel. Go ahead.
Hi, it's Lebesi. I just want to be controversial, maybe. For those who are advocating for equal funding, how do we envisage a situation where a one-person party would want to have the same funding as a party that is contesting all the positions in the country? And what are the risks that that situation will create, the situation where we'll have a mushrooming of political parties everywhere and at every corner?
Okay, great. That's it, yeah? Right. So we've got three questions, and in no particular order. If there's anyone who would like to answer any of those questions, please feel free. Go ahead.
Thank you. So the first question was in relation to ways in which the IEC can be more accessible, particularly in the period of misinformation. So I think the first thing we need to acknowledge is that conventionally, in as much as we'd like to believe that times have changed, radio and television still remain the predominant sources of information that many South Africans tend to rely on for all the information they access regarding general news, current affairs, voting, and platforms such as social media, although useful, have not necessarily been the most trusted. However, what we need to now recognize is that we've had mistrust before, but misinformation is relatively new. And the fundamental difference with misinformation and distrust is that there can be someone right now who can go on a platform and say whatever they want to say. If they've got, say, maybe 10,000 people in that platform, there's 10,000 people who would have been given information that may not necessarily be true. So that now forces institutions beyond just the IEC to be nimble in responding to misinformation, meaning that the conventional forms such as radio and television, as much as they are trusted, they are not up to the minute. They are not as flexible as maybe social media platforms may be to dispel or maybe do something like a mythbuster, for example. So I would suggest that that kind of flexibility and nimbleness may be more helpful, simply because the institution is able to respond to misinformation right there and there. So, for example, we're going to be having a lot of political rallies. There's a political party that will fill up a 90,000 stadium, and that leader can say anything about anyone, about any institution, and no one will challenge that view, meaning that the IEC does not have a platform of that nature where they can go and campaign and share information. For example, in 2024, the whole country almost came to a standstill over a screen because of how rapid the misinformation and the way in which everything was being communicated. So I'd suggest that it has to be more nimble, it has to be more agile, but also it has to be more unapologetic, because the dangers of populism are limitless, particularly when you're dealing with a country whereby citizens are already dissatisfied, feeling disenfranchised. So I'd say that would be the way to try and address that. The second one, also quite similar. So what we've seen, particularly when it comes to matters of registration and stuff like that, citizens are generally happy with all those processes, pre-election, post-election. So what we've seen with the IEC is that the pre-exposure findings are very different to the post-voting experience. So, for example, in the VPS survey, the voter participation survey, we asked citizens across the board their experiences on how the IEC was. Was it procedurally professional, helpful, and stuff like that? And it is obviously positive. However, we then have the ESS, that is the Election Satisfaction Survey. We have a survey across the country on election day where we ask participants who've just gone through the experience of voting. We asked them how were their experiences, were they happy with everything that they saw? And the overwhelming 90% upwards indicate that they are happy with everything that they saw, and they are happy with everything that they experienced at the voting station. So, but what causes that is the air and the energy of mistrust, which is obviously down to other factors as well, corruption perceptions being one of those. Generally, citizens are not going to be able to differentiate between an IEC or whoever. If you hear corruption every single day, you're going to mistrust institutions. You are not going to believe that institutions can actually work. But ironically enough, the SABC is one of the institutions that is well respected or well trusted within the context of our study. But of course, the SABC is not one institution. The radio is a form of SABC. TV is a form of is a part of SABC as well. So what we think may need to happen is that there needs to be more emphasis on actual voter experiences, because it is those experiences that inform people's views. And those experiences will not, for example, be undermined by any populist or misinformation. So I think, and of course, there is a lot that's been done already. If you go to the IEC platforms across social media, there's always something happening. There's always information available. But we do think that we may need to do more of that to aggressively dispel any hints of misinformation, but also still continue to provide information and ensure that citizens are able to trust in the process. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else would like to respond?
Maybe just a quick one on the last question, because I think maybe the colleague can go through the different typologies that we're talking about. A demand for equal distribution would apply to a public funding regime, because then that also depends on whether a country, the regime in place, provides campaign funding, or is it for represented parties? So that goes into the architecture of political funding. I think, as far as I'm aware, there's only 3 countries on the African continent: Lesotho, Angola, Mozambique, that provide campaign funding. But for us, you will still have to prove, your worth before you can have access to. So it depends on the typology, and so it needs a much more elaborate discussion, for which time we don't have here.
Thank you. I just want to attend to the question, the view that, it's not necessary to establish a separate institution to manage political funding. And my response to that is that that response seems to be ignorant of the fact that now that election season is coming, the Commission finds itself, entangled in very, if you like, issues that are very, in my view, unimportant, that may be linked to political funding, because someone would have had a view about, the Commission and how it dealt with certain funding issues and all of that. And this is at the time when, as an EMB, election takes center stage, and it's very important that election management is therefore considered as such. I'm just saying that a straight card, straight jacketed approach may not necessarily give us the solution. Thanks.
Right, I think that brings us to the end of this panel discussion, which has been very long. Round of applause for our panelists, and I hand it over to you now.
Thank you so much, Professor. May I release the amazing panel, lots and lots of intellectual feast, theories, all sorts of discussions. Thank you very much. We truly appreciate. Round of applause. Thank you, Danki. On that note, Jan, it's been one hell of an afternoon. On that note, Commissioner Love, Vice Chairperson of the Electoral Commission, as you close, let's bring this project to an end. Please come through.
Thank you very much to our program director as well as our moderator. Program director, I'm not sure that this is going to bring the discussion to an end, because if you listened especially to Dr. Shale, you had to shake yourself and say, the discussion is really only at its beginning stage. So I think that we can collectively express a huge amount of thanks again to the 9 contributors, to the wonderful editorial capacity that Professor Casanelli brought to this whole process, as well as the journal itself, and especially to EISA, happy birthday for 30 years. Fellow commissioners, CEO, and the management team, I think that what has been pulled together today is something that is very, very important to grapple with. It's something that I don't think is a small issue when you consider the importance of securing democracy as something that the citizenry have faith in. There are very many ways in which democracy can be eroded, but if people don't understand a political system that enables real choice, enables equity, enables a true understanding and a transparent contestation, but also with clear rules that are comprehensive, I think all of those things go to undermining democracy if those things are not in place. And there are many thoughts that have come out from the journal, which I think we all have to reflect on. And I use just by way of example, the extent to which, as Professor Mkuno said, can we look at multi-party democracy fund and the absence of popular knowledge and contribution to it almost as an indicator of the extent to which we actually have the buy-in of the citizenry, not just to the current party funding regime, but to the democratic project itself. The two are definitely intertwined. The rent seeking and the threat that poses in a democracy is something I think that is also emphasized in the theory. So as the CEO started off by saying, transparency alone is not enough. The judge emphasized very heavily the importance not just of society in general, but of whistleblowers. And obviously in that we need to think of their protection. We can't allow an erosion of dignity. And I know that it's been said repeatedly that there is a significant gap in whatever regime of political funding we put in place, and whoever ultimately is the correct custodian of that process. And that's a much more intensive discussion, as you can hear. But we can't, even in the local government space, where the political funding is not there, allow an erosion of dignity. And for now, the Commission has to fall back on the code of conduct. But vote buying is something that really is just one indicator of how we are making, as was emphasized by Prof. Sitole, how we are making money become the point and not the public good. Let's not do that. I want to thank everybody who's put this all together, the staff of the IEC, as well as, of course, our editor and our two deputy editors, Dr. Shale and the CEO, and also, of course, anybody who was involved in peer review. Thank you all for your attention. Thank you all for your questions and participation. And hopefully this is a discussion that will be taken forward in a very intensive, intellectually challenging way as we have been given the start by this journal. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, on that note, thank you very much. There's refreshments on the foyer. Those who are driving back home, drive safely. And I'm hoping that this book will go a long distance. You read, share, review, share ideas. The floor is opened. Thank you so much. Have a good, beautiful evening. Chirilos, bye-bye, ciao, ciao. See ya. Thank you, bye-bye.